When Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped into the hearing chamber, she came armed with evidence, while JD Vance had a rehearsed story ready to go. What started out as a policy debate quickly turned into a ruthless setup. There were ethnic jabs, public shame on live TV, and a sneering face seen by countless viewers. But she didn't waver. She launched a $250 million lawsuit that turned the courtroom into a battleground for respect and truth. The media went wild, alliances fractured, and the nation watched a vice president facing trial for misusing power. Will JD Vance finally face some consequences? Or will Jasmine Crockett find herself overwhelmed by the very institution she dared to challenge? You'll want to keep an eye on this one. That morning, Capitol Hill felt less like a center of governance and more like a battlefield in an unspoken war. Room 226 in the Dirksen Senate Office Building turned into a pressure cooker, with polished wooden desks shining under the harsh lights and flags silently witnessing the unfolding drama. The agenda said they were reviewing the federal healthcare budget, but everyone in the room knew it was about much more than just numbers. It was about who gets ahead and who just gets by. JD Vance, sitting front and center in his slick charcoal three-piece suit, adjusted his nameplate confidently, as if he owned the place. He scanned the room like a tactician, giving a subtle nod to an aide and a discreet tap to signal the cameras. He wasn't just leading the meeting, he was asserting his dominance. "Let's proceed," he said coolly, his voice dripping with privilege. Those two words carried an unspoken threat that no one failed to notice. Jasmine Crockett walked in quietly, but her presence cut through the air like a knife. She had a purpose, striding confidently on her heels against the marble floor. In her hands was a crimson folder marked Emergency Community Health Impact. There was no smile or wave. This wasn't a public event. It felt more like a showdown. The room was packed, with reporters crammed together, their cameras snapping like hungry predators. Every microphone was aimed at her. More than 17 million Americans were tuned in live, waiting to see if the only black woman there would be silenced or ignite the chamber. Jasmine took her seat, unzipped her folder, and laid out printed reports, maps, and charts, data presented with stark clarity. Her first words were calm, yet her gaze fixed on JD Vance. "We're not talking hypotheticals here. We're facing real harm." The room went quiet. The truth had stepped in, unapologetically. As her words settled in like ash after a blast, Jasmine reached into her folder, not for theatrics, but for proof forged in quiet strength. She pulled out a single sheet, folded once, its edges frayed from use, and placed it before her. With a brief pause, her finger tapped the embedded screen on the desk. The lights dimmed a bit, and the display behind her flickered to life. No bells and whistles, just sheer authority. A CDC bar graph formed, its red columns rising like warning signs on a seismograph. No smooth transitions, just unvarnished truth. Jasmine stood up, her voice calm and steady as she spoke into the microphone. "According to revised projections," she said, firm as steel, "these cuts will impact over 9.3 million Americans, mainly veterans, welders, miners, truckers, those who built this country, now wiped off the budget." Her words hit like glass breaking beneath your feet, subtle yet unmistakable. The screen changed to the next slide before anyone could react. The visuals were raw and real, actual patients, not staged photos. There was a man in his 70s, oxygen tubes framing his gaunt face, sitting in a rusty trailer in West Virginia. A Marine Corps veteran in Texas, shirtless under the summer sun, injecting insulin beside a broken fridge, his gaze far away. A coal miner from Kentucky, his face pale and skin drawn tight against his bones, documented precisely as stage 4 lung cancer. The room's lights glinted off the screen, etching each image into memory. Jasmine stood firm, hands relaxed at her sides. "These aren't just numbers. These are names I've memorized," she said, her voice low but resolute. No tremor, no rise in volume, just relentless facts, each one landing like a hammer against stone. Moments ago, the chamber had buzzed with murmurs, but now it was still. Even the stenographer paused mid-sentence. At first, JD Vance just sat there, but then a tiny shift in his posture revealed his arrogance. He leaned back slowly, elbow resting on the armrest like he was just casually watching a street performance from a cafe. Then came the smirk, starting off small, just one corner of his mouth twitching up, showing a hint of teeth, but all wrapped up in condescension. His arms crossed, definitely not in a relaxed way, more like he was staging a scene. He watched her, as if he were a director noticing an actor straying from the script. Almost without anyone noticing, He raised a finger, tracing a slow spiral in the air. A signal. An aide 2 rows back picked it up, smirking knowingly. Another one leaned forward, typed something on a tablet, then nudged a fellow colleague. It was clear she was putting on a performance. Vance didn't feel the need to interrupt. He knew he could just sit back and let her wear herself out, ready to brush aside her passion as mere theatrics. But as Jasmine presented her next data sheet, layering truth over pain, he suddenly leaned forward, not to engage but to strike, his arms uncrossed, straightening as if to assert dominance. Then, with the kind of measured delivery that suggested he was all too aware of the cameras, he said, "Miss Crockett, this isn't a theater stage. This is Congress." Those words hit hard, like a slap on cold marble, sharp and calculated. For a moment, even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to still. Everyone in that room got the underlying message, even if it wasn't said out loud. He wasn't just dismissing her argument. He was questioning her very legitimacy. The implication was crystal clear. Her voice was dramatic, her presence ornamental, and her data merely props. He was reducing a black woman with conviction to a spectacle. This insult wasn't merely about policy disagreements. It came from a place of decades of veiled scorn. Like a seasoned performer, he added, "Let's save the soap opera for the networks that thrive on it." That grin that followed wasn't just a smirk. It was a verdict. He wasn't in a debate. He was mocking her. "Honestly, I've seen interns make clearer points without needing slides and a spotlight," he continued, his tone heavy with disdain. "Every time you raise your voice, Congress seems to get a little dumber." Then, narrowing his eyes in smug amusement, he delivered his final blow. "If I wanted a lecture, I'd stream one from someone who's actually studied the budget." Behind him, the reaction was immediate and smug. An aide tilted his head back, trying to hold back laughter like a kid in church. Another nudged his buddy, probably jotting down something for social media. Vance didn't even look at Jasmine as he spoke. His gaze went past her, over her, treating her like an inconvenience instead of a peer, a symbol instead of a person. The racial undertones were subtle but clear. She wasn't too loud. She was just too visible, too bold, too black. And for that, he aimed to erase her in the most public way possible. The cameras captured everything. The words, the laughter, the toxic vibe spreading through the room, like poison in a stream. But most importantly, they caught her reaction. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink, though her face showed tiny shifts, clear as day on the high-definition feed. Her lips stayed tight, her brow smooth, but her gaze tightened just a bit. Not anger, more like readiness. A silent signal that said, "You wanted a show? Well, here it is." That single glance, captured without a word, made a louder statement than any comeback. It declared, "You aimed for my dignity, but you missed." But Vance misread her silence as defeat, and that mistake would only draw him deeper into his malice. He shifted in his seat, not to respond but to break things down. One hand fiddled with his cufflink, while the other tapped his microphone twice, sharp, intentional, almost theatrical. "Let's talk about qualifications," he began, his voice a low hum, too steady to be friendly. His words flowed with the practiced cadence of someone who knew every syllable was being recorded, transcribed, and broadcast to countless viewers. Miss Crockett is, of course, well known for her impassioned speeches, her viral moments, her hashtag, and her progressive podcast appearances. The air in the room grew dense. It wasn't just his volume, it was the underlying sharpness of his words. "But passion doesn't equal policy," he continued, pausing just long enough for a smirk to creep across his face. "She's a viral sensation, not a serious legislator." The statement hit like a bombshell, creating a stunned quiet rather than outrage. The kind of silence that follows a boundary being crossed, though no one yet knows how to articulate it. No one made a sound, not even the reporters. Vance savored the moment, soaking up the weight of his words like an actor waiting for applause. Then, almost casually, and as if for effect, he dropped another line. "Viral tears don't fund hospitals." The silence broke. No one shouted. It was just the sound of chairs shifting, quick intakes of breath, and a faint scrape of heels on marble. A senator adjusted herself, clearly rattled. An aide at the back muttered, "Jesus," under his breath. A female senator whispered in disbelief. "Did he just say that?" Her voice, soft yet picked up by a hot mic, cut through the room like a needle. Vance didn't flinch. He sank deeper into his chair, hands clasped, posture self-satisfied, as if he had just secured his spot on the evening news. His aides were typing away, already brainstorming the spin, but they missed the tense shift in the room, the tiny cracks in decorum, patience, and conscience. He hadn't just undermined her work, he'd turned her career into clickbait, dismissed her expertise with a single phrase, and wielded his platform to invalidate everything she represented, not because it was wrong, but because it was hers, and that made it a threat. The chamber didn't erupt because this had moved beyond a debate. It was a power maneuver disguised as policy. Yet there was Jasmine, still silent, still sitting there, becoming the eye of a storm that had little to do with numbers, and everything to do with whether truth could be spoken when it looked like her. As Vance's disdain still echoed in the air, Jasmine reached for a truth he couldn't manipulate. She kept her voice steady and her posture relaxed. With a fluid motion, she slid a document across the desk, almost like she was delivering a final judgment. The Government Accountability Office seal was there in blue, a bit smudged, a sign that it had been recently handled. With a single tap on her screen, the monitor switched to grayscale, displaying a stark chart. No fancy images, just a sharp increase in numbers alongside one line of text. "This is an independent GAO report," she stated, her words as sharp as a blade. "It shows that 78% of the proposed budget cuts will hit families of color directly." She let that figure sit there, bare and untouched, just cold hard data, peer-reviewed and irrefutable. She didn't look at the senators or try to sway the press. Her eyes were locked on Vance, steady and unwavering, like a spotlight in a courtroom. Her chin was firm, shoulders squared, not tense with rage, but grounded in generations of restraint. She didn't blink. The chamber shifted, no longer just a debate setting but a mirror reflecting reality. Her gaze wasn't an invitation. It was a chilling warning, a reckoning wrapped in silence. For a brief moment, Vance looked frozen, caught mid-laugh, like a guy who didn't know how to behave at a funeral. Then, unexpectedly, and without a hint of shame, he burst into laughter, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the limestone wall, a violent disruption the room hadn't experienced yet. 78%, he scoffed, amusement flickering in his voice as he leaned back, shaking his head like he was hearing a fairy tale rather than facing a serious indictment. He wiped at his eye, pretending to dry an imaginary tear in feigned disbelief. That laughter wasn't just mean-spirited, it was pure contempt disguised in a suit. No one joined in, not his aides, not his colleagues, not even the press, who peered through their cameras as if witnessing decency unravel in real time. Yet he continued, unrestrained, because those in power rarely hear the word stop. His laughter didn't drown out the report, it only amplified it. The 78% became real, animated by the very man making light of its fallout. Cruelty isn't just about laughter, and Vance, still smiling, took mockery to a whole new level of legacy theft. He leaned in, elbows on the table, lowering his voice to pull everyone into a deeper silence. That smile of his wasn't just casual, it was sharp, rehearsed, and ready to cut. "You know, Miss Crockett," he drawled, stretching each word as if sharpening a knife, "some folks here think you're like Rosa Parks." You could feel the room get colder, not in temperature, but in the atmosphere. His tone felt less curious and more like a performance, perfectly timed. Then came the jab. "You're not Rosa Parks. You're just the budget version for those who don't know their history." Instead of gasps, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The sting of his words hit like a bullet, aiming not just at her achievements, but going after the very essence of history. The air felt heavy. Vance leaned back, as if he had just presented some dry statistic, rather than attacking a legacy. He wasn't debating policy. He was critiquing the very foundation of protest, pain, and dignity fought for in buses and jails, now perceived as some cheap trick. His words reshaped the atmosphere, clear in their malice. No one laughed this time. Even the Republican senators seemed uncomfortable. Their silence now feels like agreement. Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. His attack said more about him than her. He didn't just step over a line. He trampled on something sacred, with the arrogance of someone who's never recognized its value. Even after that hit, Jasmine didn't react with anger. Instead, she stood up in silence, a silence that spoke louder than any shouts could. She moved with purpose, gathering her reports, charts, GAO findings, and photos of neglected wards and closed clinics, treating each one like a wound she wouldn't let him brush aside. Her fingers traced the faded yet sharp red stamp on her folder, Emergency Community Health Impact, symbolizing everything she carried. Her chair creaked as she stood, not hurriedly but with a quiet strength, like a verdict coming to light. No words were exchanged, no eye contact was made. The room, once filled with power struggles, fell into an eerie quiet. No aide moved, no camera clicked. Even Vance, who usually laughed easily, sat there with a cautious gaze, uncertain if he had truly won or stirred something deeper. Jasmine turned once, her silhouette against the marble wall, her voice low yet impossible to ignore. I wasn't raised to shout. I was raised to prepare. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a lesson born from history, from mothers who faced far worse, from grandmothers who marched on longer. It wasn't meant for the cameras, it was for the spirit. Her words cut deeper than any insult could because she didn't fight fire with fire. She changed the game entirely. She didn't seek applause or validation. All she needed was that one line, coming from a place Vance couldn't comprehend, a place of discipline, resilience, and unwavering determination. Her footsteps didn't echo as she walked away. They landed like a prophecy come true. But Jasmine's silence wasn't giving up. It was a smart strategy. Just 6 days later, she made that clear. When dawn broke on Capitol Hill, it wasn't the usual briefings or schedules that stirred things up, but a headline that hit hard. Representative Jasmine Crockett files $250 million lawsuit against VP JD Vance. Suddenly, Washington went quiet. Phones buzzed, inboxes filled, and before aides even finished their coffee, the 32-page lawsuit was being dissected by legal blogs, campaigns, and news outlets. This wasn't just a symbolic move, it was all-out war. Filed in the D.C. Circuit Federal Court, the suit was put together with the skill of experienced lawyers who weren't bluffing. Each paragraph felt sharp. The title page, stark and serious. Names, dates, and numbers you couldn't ignore. Jasmine Crockett versus Vice President JD Vance. The complaint was thorough, brutal, and precise. It didn't stop at claiming defamation. It laid out the intent, following her degradation step by step like a tracker on a trail. By page 6, there was a sworn statement from a Capitol staffer confirming a mocking rehearsal before the hearing. Page 9 had video stills of Vance smirking, while aides chuckled at a racialized jab. And on page 12, there was a damaging email thread hinting at coordinated efforts to undermine her credibility, complete with timestamps. By page 16, it quoted those inflammatory lines still burning in America's conscience. Viral tears don't fund hospital. You're not Rosa Parks. You're the budget version for people who never read history. This was more than a lawsuit. It was an indictment of Vance, the system backing him, and a centuries-old playbook that confused humiliation with governance. The media exploded. The Atlantic published a noontime editorial titled, "Not Just Personal. Crockett's case could redefine congressional power dynamics." The New York Times dispatched a constitutional expert to weigh in on whether a vice president could be called to a defamation deposition. CNN aired a special called Accountability or Agenda, while Fox News labeled it a theatrical distraction. Yet, one phrase rang out even among the naysayers. First time in U.S. history, a black congresswoman stood in federal court, dragging institutional cruelty into a space where spin wouldn't help. Reporters camped outside her office, but she said nothing. No statements, no press conferences. Her silence was deafening, deliberate. Meanwhile, the White House was in a tizzy. Vance wasn't just a liability anymore. He was a defendant, staring down discovery, depositions, and a courtroom where bravado meant nothing. Still, he played it cool, posing for cameras. That evening, leaving a donor dinner in Cincinnati, he faced a swarm of lenses. Adjusting his sunglasses, he spat out his line. "This is nothing but a leftist legal stunt." The delivery was smug, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. His body language, once confident for the cameras, seemed ready to crumble. Beneath the surface, the truth was unmistakable. This wasn't a stunt. It was a reckoning, and Vance had just been served. The lawsuit wasn't just about anger. It had real proof to back it up. It all kicked off with a technical review that nobody thought would be significant. Jasmine's legal team, sifting through files, stumbled upon an audio feed labeled Translation Channel 3 Standby. Amid the static and unclear voices, a phrase came through, captured by an ambient mic in Jasmine's earpiece that had been left on during the pre-hearing setup. They cleaned up the audio, and a male voice came through, sounding casual yet deliberate. "Just push her hard enough. She'll break. They always do." Vance didn't think anyone was listening when he spoke. He didn't intend for this to be part of the record. It wasn't just a slip. It was intentional. The audio alone was shocking, but there was more. A subpoena obtained internal communications from Vance's media team. Out of countless memos, one email caught attention. It was sent just 48 hours before the hearing and said, "Script the insult. Film the meltdown." This wasn't just strategy. It was a setup. What the public perceived as an organic flare-up was actually a carefully orchestrated takedown, staged with precision, knowing exactly when to interrupt, when to laugh, and when to smirk. Jasmine didn't step into a debate. She walked into an ambush designed for rating. The legal team was taken aback, but quickly sprang into action, logging the file, backing it up, and presenting it to the judge and the House Ethics Committee. Even the doubters among staffers recognized the deliberate nature of the attack. Premeditated cruelty. The phrase, "they always do," lingered in Jasmine's mind. It wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It reflected the mindset of those who had broken people before, who made it a part of their job. Now, thanks to a forgotten earpiece and an aide's arrogance, the truth had gained real power. Things took a turn in Congress when three progressive leaders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley, called for an investigation by the House Ethics Committee into Vance's actions. They didn't hold back in their criticisms. They talked about the weaponization of office, racially charged manipulation, and breaching public trust. The news of the submission got out, and Politico's headline caught everyone's attention. "The Squad Strikes Back. Ethics Probe into Vance Gains Steam." Pressley spoke on the Capitol steps saying, "This wasn't just politics. It was premeditated harm. If we don't call it out, we allow it to go on for generations." Her words carried historical weight. Across 7 states, people organized silent marches for dignity. No shouting, just rows of folks dressed in black, holding signs like, "We saw it, we heard it, we remember." In Atlanta, a 12-year-old girl held a sign that said, "I'm 12, I don't break." Meanwhile, a Vietnam vet marched in Cleveland, carrying a picture of his daughter, an ER nurse who had been laid off. Drones filmed a black river of solidarity, each step rejecting the idea that silence means complicity. It wasn't just a protest. It was a mourning for decency. Law schools began to change their course offering. NYU rolled out a class titled Ethics in the Age of Optics, while Howard proposed using the Crockett versus Vance case as a study in government ethics. Jasmine's stand turned into a case study, shedding light on institutional gaslighting. But Vance didn't back down. With advisors at his side, he took to the press podium and delivered a rehearsed jab. "I speak for the silent majority tired of weaponized victimhood." That phrase hit hard, aimed at Jasmine, the marchers, and the students. A leaked video showed him backstage, grinning as he said, "This'll go viral. Good ratings." The facade began to slip. People online started asking, is he the vice president or just a media director pretending to uphold democracy? The courtroom was so silent you could feel the tension in the air. Vance stepped up to the stand, but his navy suit felt less like a shield this time. His jaw was tight, and you could see his confidence was wavering. Reporters were scribbling away, trying to capture every moment. The prosecution's lawyer stood and fixed Vance with a stare. "Mr. Vice President, did you give the go-ahead for that statement comparing Representative Crockett to a famous actress before the hearing on May 12th? Vance blinked, his tongue pressed against his cheek as he replied, "I don't recall," in a flat tone that felt like a slap. Juror 6, a retired principal, sighed and shook her head in clear disappointment. Vance's fingers started tapping nervously on the stand. The jurors weren't convinced. Out of nowhere, Jasmine stood up and took the floor. She didn't shout or point fingers. Instead, she locked eyes with him, the same man who had poked fun at her identity, and said, "You don't forget what you say when you actually mean it." The entire room went still. Her words, heavy with meaning, hit harder than any shout could. Vance's hands tightened into fists, and his story began to unravel. Cameras swung to capture the moment. Suddenly, accountability was no longer just a word. The verdict hit like a thunderclap. The judge spoke slowly, making each word count. "This court finds Vice President James David Vance guilty of using government resources for public humiliation, abuse that was planned, systemic, and damaging to democracy." Vance sat there, completely still, his fingertips digging into the table. "We're awarding $250 million in damages to Representative Jasmine Crockett, which will come from the Vice President's office and those who helped him." Gasps filled the room, not out of shock, but because of the weight of the decision. The judge continued, "We're sending materials to the DOJ for further investigation. Effective immediately, Vice President Vance loses his FCC regulatory authority." A murmuring spread through the crowd. Vance's ambition had finally backfired. Jasmine remained calm, closing her well-worn blue folder. The audience stood not out of obligation, but instinctively, honoring the woman who had brought arrogance to its knees. Her heels clicked in a steady rhythm as she walked out, passing Vance without even looking at him. He appeared empty. Sunlight poured through the doors as she stepped outside, not in victory but feeling complete. History shifted, not because of the verdict, but because of a woman who chose truth over chaos. Just 3 days later, Jasmine gathered folks for a press conference at the Lincoln Memorial. It was pretty minimal. Just a podium, a couple of flags, and black women from all over the country. No flashy banners, just their presence speaking volumes. She carried herself with a grace that spoke to her struggles. "I won't take long, but what I'm sharing today will last," she told the crowd. Reporters went quiet. "We've seen what unchecked power can do. I'm starting the Silent Armor Fund to support black and brown women as they fight back and rebuild in spaces that often try to hold them down." The name, Silent Armor, suggested they were ready for battle. The fund was set up to offer legal help, media resources, small grants, and training in how to navigate the media and fight in court. "Silence isn't a sign of weakness. It's a strategy honing its edge." The crowd felt solid, with journalists sensing a shift in the air. A young girl nearby whispered, "I want to be her." Jasmine wrapped up with, "We don't create swords to hurt. We make them so our daughters won't have to." In that moment, history felt like it paused. Jasmine's win really stirred things up. The Washington Post published a piece called "The Reckoning We Missed," while Time showcased Jasmine with a photo that had a strong title, "Dignity is not a costume." It didn't stop there. Harvard, Georgetown, and Yale even started courses about narrative warfare and ethics. Public forums buzzed with conversations, feeling more like a collective sigh than protests. In Cleveland, when community college students watched Jasmine's speech, they applauded. In Baltimore, middle school girls wrote letters that went viral. HBCUs revisited the legacies of Fannie Lou Hamer and Angela Davis, drawing smart connections to today. The Silent Armor Fund emerged as a guide, giving black women the tools they need for legal and digital protection. One grandmother in Tulsa advised her granddaughter, "Make sure your truth resonates in your heart." The Crockett Clause called for media monitors to oversee hearings. Scholars even came up with phrases like weaponized dismissal. Jasmine's powerful quote, "You don't forget what you say when you mean it," found its way onto banners and into textbooks. Her quietness wasn't about giving up. It was about having focus, carrying the weight of generations. She didn't just call out Vance. She revealed a system of power that relies on staying untouchable. Jasmine showed that dignity is a right for all of us, not just a privilege. Her restraint was a form of defiance, and her resilience sparked a revolution. The question now isn't whether another ambush is on the horizon, but rather who will step up for the next woman. Jasmine paved the way, but will we take that journey? Let's share her message, teach it, and stand against complicity. Justice is something we need to practice regularly. Let's answer her call.